Good morning, Matrix, and welcome to Paper 2. Now, this is one of the scariest papers, and I'm Ms. Kruger, and I'm here to help you through this paper. So let's dive right in. Now, what am I going to try and show you here? Firstly, we're going to look at the structure of Paper 2. If you know the structure and you know what to answer, it becomes easier to actually analyze what you have to analyze and answer successfully. And of course, if you study with the structure in mind, you will be a champ in this paper. Now, let's look at the layout of the paper. There are 3 sections that you have to get through. In total, you have to answer 5 questions at the end of this paper. Now, it consists of Section A, Section B, and Section C. They more or less weigh the same thing. Section A is your poetry, and you'll notice that it counts 30 marks. Why? Because you need to answer 3 questions. 2 will be your seen poetry, and 1 will be unseen poetry, which is unfortunately compulsory here. In Section B, we're going to look at the novel, and the novel is 25 marks. Now, we'll go through each of these sections when we approach them. Section C is the drama. Now, take note. You have to combine the question you've chosen in Section B, and you have to do the opposite question or type of question in Section C. In other words, if I've chosen in Section B to answer the literature essay, I have to answer the contextual questions in Section C, and this is not optional. You have to choose 2 different types of questions to answer for each of these sections. Now, what's lovely about the paper is that it is filled with instructions to guide you through this paper. Now, you'll notice that this features in your booklet that you will receive from the department in your question paper. And here it shows you exactly what will be in the paper. Now, this is from November last year, just to give you a rough idea of what you can expect. Page number 1 will be the cover page that tells you, okay, I'm answering paper 2, right? The second page will most likely be your instructions. Please read this carefully. We do give you detailed ideas and instructions on what to do exactly in each section and what pitfalls there might be. But I'm going to go through this to help you out there. And then you get the table of content. Now here I want you to take a look quickly. You'll notice that each of the sections are mentioned in order. Now for Section A, you have to answer only 3 questions. 1 is question 5, which is compulsory. You cannot not do that question. But what's nice about it is question 1, 2, 3, and 4, they are choice questions. And that is nice because you can then choose which poems you know better than the others and that you can answer successfully. Now, for the paper last year, you'll see there, remember the Zulu Girl, a Heart Frost, an African Elegy, were the questions that were asked. So it might not be the same for your upcoming exam, but you should know all 12 poems. But some of them you like more than others, don't you? So choose carefully. Then we have Section B. Now don't be alarmed. You'll notice there are novels here that you've never done in your life. Please don't choose them. You only answer the questions of the novel and the drama that you've done this year in Matric. You might have done, for example, Othello in another grade, but please, if you're doing Hamlet this year in class in Matric, do not choose Othello, even if you might be successful in answering that question. Right, and we'll go through how to choose the different questions in each section. Now, together with this, to help you out a bit, there will be a separate page or the next page, which will have a ticking section. And it will tell you, have you answered 2 questions of the seen poetry? Tick. And this is to help you remember to answer 5 questions and which questions work together. So have a look at that, tick it off at the end of your paper to ensure that you have answered all 5 required questions. Right, we are going to now look at Section A. Here, there are 5 questions to answer. We're going to look first at question 1, 2, 3, and 4. As mentioned before, these will be your prescribed poems. What does that mean? It means the poems that you've actually done in class, that you've analyzed, that you've studied, and that you've possibly written tests on this year. So together with that, you'll notice that question 1 is your lit essay question. Now, most of you could attempt this if you wanted to. It seems a bit daunting, like 250 words. How am I going to do that? But here's the trick. If you know your content fairly well, it becomes easy peasy to get this done. But if you don't like the essay question, or you don't understand it, or even if you just don't like that poem, rather look at question 2, 3, and 4. Now, these questions are your contextual questions. That means that they are shorter questions and they are easier to answer. Now, with poetry, the structure for the poem that we set out, we normally have 4 questions. 2 of those questions will be 2 marks worth. The other 2, 3 marks apiece. So ensure that you actually read through the poems that you think you want to answer and double check that you are capable of answering these questions. Don't just choose them because they're easier. Perhaps question 1, perhaps the poem essay is an easier question to ask, because remember, in question 1, we can only ask certain things, and we'll run through that now to kind of guide you on how to get that done in your question paper. Right, remember 2 questions here. Please, I'm begging, do not answer all 4 questions here. If you do that, we only assess the first 2 that you've answered. The rest don't count any marks. You get a big fat 0 for that. And what that means is you've essentially wasted your time and you've potentially lost the marks where you could have done really well in a specific question like question 3 or 4. Then let's go over to the last part of this section. Now, question 5 is your unseen poem. That means it hasn't been prescribed, you've never seen it in your life, and your teacher would not have gone through this. Well, sometimes maybe you're lucky and they have gone through it. Score, right? But you have to go through this question, and what I advise you to do is go through this question last. Now, going back to our structure, you don't have to answer in order A, B, and C of your sections. As long as you number the questions correctly and you write at the top, section A, question 1, or whatever you choose there, you may answer in any order that you feel is better for your nerves perhaps, or the questions that you feel more comfortable with. So say, for example, and this is my advice to my learners, perhaps it will aid you as well. I've found that the literature essay for either the novel or for the drama is something that stresses them out a lot in this exam. So I advise them, start with the essay, get it out of the way, so that if you overspend time here, you're able to catch it up with your contextual questions as well as your poem questions, because these things have become second nature, hopefully throughout this year. Right, and then secondly, you can choose, am I more well-versed in my poetry or in my contextual questions of my novel or my drama? And then you answer either the poetry or your novel or your drama contextual questions. And then subsequently those that are left over. Leave question 5 to last. All right, so let's look at section B, which is the novel. Now, you'll notice that it is 25 marks, and the same is repeated in section C, the drama. Both of them count 25 marks, because you'll either have to discuss the essay, the lit essay question, or the contextual questions, one of each of the sections. Now, take note, you have to know the novel out of your head. There's no other option here. And you have to know the characters, and we'll go into detail of in a moment. You have to know the plot, and then you have to decide, can I answer the essay question better, or am I better versed at answering the contextual questions of the section? Now remember, the lit essay question is 400 words minimum. Don't go over 450, but you have to at least, in your analysis, get to 400 words. Right, let's move on to section C. Now, this is the drama. I'm going to remind you that there will be more than one drama on offer here, because different people in the country have offered different dramas at their school. And that's why it's question 10 to question 15. Please ensure that you only answer the drama that you have covered in your school this year in grade 12. Now, once again, choose between the essay or the contextual question here. Now here is a very big important note. You cannot answer in section B a lit essay and in section C a literature essay. We will only mark the first essay and we will discard whatever you've written for the second one. You will get a big fat 0 out of 25. So please either choose the essay in section B and the contextual questions you then have to do in section C, or you can do the contextual questions of section B, but then you have to do the essay, the lit essay, in section C. All right, please remember to write that down for yourself. We have found that learners lose quite a bit of marks if they answer the wrong sequence of questions in this paper. Right, now there is a suggested time frame that is also repeated in your paper, but I would suggest that you actually start with your essay. Now, whether that is section C or section B, it's up to you. You will see that they have the same allocated time frame. Now, ensure that you don't use up over an hour of your time on each of those sections, because you still have 3 poems that you need to answer. I do suggest that you start with the largest chunk, so either contextual questions or, as I've mentioned before, the literature essay. Now, you should spend most of your time on the preparation and then finally on the editing of your piece. You only need to have something like a mind map. You do not need to write a first draft, and then you go directly into your final piece that you write for marks. And remember, with the lit essays, planning is everything. If you do not plan properly, you will not be able to formulate your argument successfully here. And I'm going to show you how we plan for our essays so that maybe you can copy this. If you're not used to it, then you need to practice it before you attempt this in your paper. Right, for the contextual questions, it's very simple. You have to read, you have to look at your verbs that we've used, your instruction verbs, and then what about this sentence or part that we've extracted from the actual piece that you've done do we want you to answer? Now, please take note, in contextual questions, we are going to give you 2 sections to look at from the text. Now, whether that's the drama or the novel, and you will have to place it in context. That means you need to know, where am I, who is speaking, what happened just before this, and what will subsequently happen after this. All right, but we'll get to that just now. Now let's have a look at each of the sections individually, because we're going to look at how do I study for this, what do I need to look out for in this particular section. We're going to start with poetry so we can sequence everything in your head. Now firstly, let's talk about the poem essay. Now what the department has found here, or we as markers essentially, is that you answer this question very superficially. That means that your answers are not very in-depth and you haven't analyzed it fully. So when you are discussing this paper, or this particular question, my apologies, then you have to not only regurgitate the summary of the poem, you have to dive into the figures, the diction, and the message or theme that is within this poem. And that's what I've put there for you. When you study this, you have to focus on the structure of the poem. Why does it look the way it does? Why has certain punctuation marks been used? Then you move right over into diction, the choice of words, because this will place the entire poem into context. And of course, we will have tone. Tone is the attitude that comes across in your poem and what the speaker is feeling at that stage. Now, while I'm remembering this, ladies and gents, when we talk about the speaker, I'm not referring to the poet. The poet is the person that wrote the poem. And yes, it gives us a broad overview of where possibly in time frame this could have been written, or even why it could have been written. But the speaker take the poet completely out of the equation, and now it becomes you and me, perhaps even. And that makes it more relatable than just the poet. Sometimes, and you'll understand this through the poetry that you've studied, that poems transcends boundaries and they become relevant to us in our lives now. And this is also why we do poetry. But before I ramble on, let's move on here. Now, very important, and this goes with point number 1, you have to use your analytical skills that you've built up since primary school. you have to use the knowledge of your figures of speech, your poetic devices, and all the little bits and bobs that you've collected over the years of how to look at poetry, because we are stressed in the exam, especially for paper 2, because it's a lot of words and writing to get through in only 2.5 hours. It's only 80 marks, and that's quite daunting. So, for you to be able to analyze a poem, even when you forget the notes you've studied from class, it means that you have to work through examples. So ensure that you hone in on those analytical skills, look at past papers, see if you can answer them, look at the memo, and that way it boosts your confidence and you're able to remember these skills, even if you forget the notes. Now, the other thing that the department found is that there's a very vague overview of the poem given in your poem essay. You literally just regurgitate what you've learned from class. That doesn't work here. Why? Because we give you a very specific topic to focus on. And there are certain elements within that topic that you have to look at. Not only can you give me the literal term and the overall theme or message, but you have to look deeper. You have to go into the connotation of the words. You have to look at the figures that they've used. Why have they used it? Is it effective? In other words, is it successful in bringing across the message or creating a specific image in our heads? And this is what I want to see in this poem. Now remember, there is a very clear structure that you have to follow. When we talk about certain things in a poem essay, it means that you, number one, have to quote from the text. Now, when I'm talking about diction or the choice of words, no less than 5 words in your answer and your paragraph that you're discussing. When I'm referring to things like structure, the topography, the layout, even the punctuation you can mention here, then I have to quote a line to emphasize what I'm trying to say, for example. So make sure that it follows more or less the same structure as you would do for a literature essay, except now you have 2 paragraphs as your analytical paragraphs. You still need an introduction and a thesis, and you still need a conclusion at the end of this essay. Right, and remember, 200 words. And then I think this becomes obvious in all the papers that we've gone through, but your focus has to be very direct now. You cannot just mention anything you know about the poem, because number one, it wastes time, and your time is very limited in this paper. Secondly, you're not going to get marks for it. So you might be rambling on about the poem, and it might be fantastic, but you will never be awarded marks for that. So please beware of that. Read your questions carefully. Right, what do I study for this paper, or this specific question, which is section A, question 1. I will ask you about the combination of the following, either diction, and I've given you a brief overview of that which you can read, imagery, and I'll definitely talk about tone. The other 3 things that become minor things which you add into your paragraph discussion is structure, punctuation, and topography. Now, if you're uncertain what they mean, revise them from the notes that you have of your poetry and from your literature book from your teacher. All right, but this is overall what we will ask. You have to know all of them, because you can understand that if I use a specific word, it can also explain what the image is in my poem. Right, so I would advise you try this one. It is quite a fun little thing. And remember, you are not only awarded marks for the content, but you get Pasala marks for your language. So even if you write really poorly and you mention 1 or 2 things about the tone and imagery, you can already score 4 marks, 3 being your language marks. All right, so think about that. Now let's go to the contextual questions. What do I study here? Now I want you to look. We have to know the literal meaning of the words. If we do not know what the words mean in the poem, how are we going to analyze them? So study is key here. Secondly, we are going to look at the figurative meaning of the words. Now, I've given you 2 additional words there in brackets, denotation and connotation. We are not going to make it easy for you. We are going to say, what is the connotation of the following word as it's used in so-and-so poem? So you need to know that connotation refers to the connection I make to the words, the figurative meaning here. And you need to remember that denotation is the literal meaning, the dictionary's definition of the word. Right, we also look at the mood and the tone. We look at the theme and the message. And remember, sometimes there can be more than one theme or message in a poem. Very often we find this more in section B and C, but it can occur in your poetry as well. Right, then we also have to look at imagery. Now, how do I figure out what the imagery is? Well, it's quite simple. You study your figures of speech. But, and I'm going to warn you again, we won't ask you identify the figure of speech. That's way too easy. You're grade 12 now. We are going to say identify the comparison, or the sound device, or the contrast. Your job is to know each of these sections and what falls under them. For example, in our comparison field, we will have metaphor, personification, and simile, and a few others that you should know by now. And so it goes. Know the categories, know what falls under each of these categories. Right, and then of course we move right over to the choice of diction. We will never ask you, why did the poet use the following words? No, it's way too simple. Your home language. So we say, discuss the choice of diction, or critically analyze this word. Right. But you should know the jargon that we use here. Rhetorical devices are very often used in language like English, so know what it means, know how to identify it. Then, of course, an emotional response. Now, red flag here. Remember, you are analyzing this specific poem, or this specific novel, or the drama. You cannot draw in from your own life's experiences, because then you are not looking at this objectively. You are now an analytical person, and your answer should be academic, not emotional. What I mean with emotional responses here is, what feeling is the poet trying to draw out of you? Right, and this creates the mood, of course. I hope you know that already. Right, now you have to know the words lines, stanzas, and of course the types of poems that we have. This is all part of your study package. You need to know what they are. But I'll show you how we help you in the exam. And then the last one that you might not have picked up is poetic devices. Now, very often this includes things like refrain, which is a large chunk that has just been repeated, or repetition, enjambment, etc. You need to know these things. You need to know how they look. You need to know how to identify them and how to quote them when asked. Okay, so what are the errors to remind you that you need to avoid for this section? You cannot answer superficially. You have to memorize those aspects. The summary of the poem, you have to look at the title of the poem, the type and the form. You have to be able to analyze the poem line by line, because you do not know which lines we have chosen for the 4 questions that we are going to ask you. You have to know the theme. You have to be able to discuss the imagery, diction, as well as the tone. And last but not least, as I've just mentioned, do not respond with your own personal commentary. You do lose marks there because you haven't looked at the content of what we've asked you. Okay, now I want to give you an example of what you can expect in the exam. This is an example from the 2020 paper, and this was the unseen poem that was used. Now, I've just given you a picture there to kind of put it in perspective for you, but what we actually do is we give you a glossary here, so that any words that are not in your frame of reference, you can then add to be successful in this poem. Now, there's a few things that will differ here that I just want to make you aware of. Firstly, the department decided 1 or 2 years ago that every single line for every single poem that's in the paper will be numbered. So don't be alarmed when you see all 16 lines there. It is to aid you to ensure that you don't answer the incorrect line. We are going to work through some of the questions here. I'm not going to give you the answers. I just want to show you what you can expect when answering this question and how you can use the words and specific things like the mark allocation to ensure that you are successful. Now, firstly, in question number 1.5, you'll notice that we've used specific lines. We say they refer to lines 1 and 4. That immediately should tell you my answer comes from these lines. But what we've also done is we've used a mark allocation. That means I tell you how deep you need to analyze. Now you can imagine that 2 marks is less than 3 marks, and therefore your 2-mark answer is not going to be as great depth answer as, for example, question 5.3 or 5.4. Now let's look at what I've asked you to do. Now here I've used the word impression, right? What idea do we get from what? And we look at here the nettles. And you have to answer it. It's as simple as that. But give me 2 ideas. You can use extracts from your actual poem that you can use in this example. For example, if we look at the first words there, line number 1, right at the end, it says the nettle bed. Now, I don't know about you, but a bed is a nice, cozy place where you sleep and it's soft. But if you look at the definition of a nettle bed, it actually is something that stings. So you should immediately recognize that this is an oxymoron and then discuss why is it effective or what feeling or impression does the poet have of this. Right, we're going to run through some of the others. Once again, I show you in 5.2 the line reference. I use the word explain. So you can't just state one thing. You have to actually dive a little bit deeper into the question here. What am I asking you to explain? The attitude. And you focus your answers solely on lines 12 and 13. All right, and then we look at lines 14 and 15. Here, once again, I've given you the action verb, which is discuss. You have to look at the words, otherwise how will you know what to answer? When you discuss something, it goes a little bit more in depth. Now there are 3 points I want you to take note of here. We asked you to discuss what? The effectiveness. Now for those of you, you've heard this word over and over again, but you still don't quite know what it is. When something is effective, it means it does its job really well. That means the image that has been portrayed is very successful. Your job is to tell me why. And this is what discuss means here. Right, what are we discussing? What is effective? It is the image. And that is created in lines 14 to 15. Remember to bring in your figures of speech or your poetic devices into your answer here. Do you see we don't actually directly ask this? Right, now we move over to critically comment. This is a much deeper, in-depth look, more than discuss, because now I'm looking at the piece of work and I'm criticizing it here. What are you discussing? You're discussing the diction. What's the diction again? The choice of words. And I'm also going to discuss how it conveys a perspective of parenthood. So if you read your questions very carefully, you will note that it very much helps you to get to where you need to be in the answer. Right, we're going to move over to section B, which is the novel. Please remember, answer the question that you select. You don't have to do the contextual questions, but I'm going to discuss, for example, the contextual questions of the novel here. All right, just one back. Now, what are some of the errors that you need to just look at? Firstly, very important, for any novel or drama which has been done more than 1 year in grade 12, you can go back to old question papers. But please remember, we will never ask the same section or the same question ever in any paper. So it's not like you can study one of the papers and score because it will be asked in the paper to come. Right, so please ensure that you do not just give literal answers. This has been a big problem in our papers. You have to dive into the figurative meaning of your questions here. Once again, allow your question mark allocation to guide you here. Very important, read the instructions. If you do not follow the instructions, you will end up doing 2 of the same questions, and unfortunately that will lose you marks. Also, do not expect the same answer twice in a paper. If in the one question we ask you to discuss something, we will never ask it again in a further question. And then, of course, you have to look at the question words, as we've said. Now, I've just briefly given you an idea of what to study and how to prepare for this. Go through the plot. Tell me about the rise in action. Tell me about the climax of the story. And that goes together with the conflict. If there's no conflict or tension in our story, then there is no rise in action. You have to know the characters. And super important, one thing we find is you do not know their names. If you don't know their names, you don't know the relation they have to each other, how are we going to answer any of the questions? Also, for each of the characters, you also need to know their characteristics. Is this a good guy? Is this a bad guy? How do they fit into my story? You have to look at the role of the narrator, if there is one. Look at the themes and the messages, the background, and the mood. Right, and then I've also just briefly rediscussed the poetry things that you need to study. But we're not going to go through this, as it is part of your previous notes. Right, let's talk about the drama. Now here, I'd like to go through how you can tackle answering the literature essay. Now, last year's paper had the following question. We look at Hamlet, for example, as our essay question. Now remember, in this section, you will have your drama, and you'll have your essay question first, then the contextual question. So depending on which drama you do, ensure that you go through both of them. If you have already answered section B, you have chosen the essay. Remember, you only look at the contextual questions. We have chosen to, for example, answer in section B the contextual questions. So now we have to look at the essay. There's no other choice here, unless you want to redo an essay, right? All right, so let's have a look here. Gertrude and Ophelia's passivity makes them vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation. Now, I've circled and highlighted a few words here for you to have a look at. We are looking at, firstly, a combination of things. Now, remember, in your essay, we structure the question based on only three things. Firstly, the characters. They will always be there in combination of two other things. It can either be the themes or the symbols. And we use this combination to formulate our essay question. Now, let's look at this. There are two characters that have been used here, both Gertrude and Ophelia. You should immediately recognize that femininity plays a role here. And this happens in all of our dramas. You will know exactly what relates to which character. Now, when you're busy studying, and this is my advice to you, summarize a specific character. Also, what is their relation to the other characters? And lastly, see if you can connect a theme, symbol, or motif with them. Why? Because it makes it much easier to answer your essay question when you're done studying this part. Right, now, passivity is what we're going to look at. You need to either prove or disprove that they are passive in the play. And once you've decided that, you can then look at the rest of the question. Now look at this word here. We say, do you agree with the above statement? Remember, if you can prove it, you can either disagree or you can agree with the statement. Let's pretend like we're agreeing with the statement. Now I have to go into depth the exploitation and the manipulation. How do you structure your essay? So you have a few choices here. In the analytical part, which is the body of the essay, paragraph 2, 3, and 4, you can discuss Gertrude as one paragraph. You can discuss Ophelia as another paragraph, and possibly another character for the last paragraph. Or alternatively, you can discuss Gertrude and Ophelia and how they are exploited or manipulated by a specific character, like Hamlet. Or the next paragraph, again, Gertrude and Ophelia with another character. And you must decide, what do I want in each paragraph? Now we're going to look at the structure very quickly, and I'm going to show you what you need to remember specifically for the literature essay. Now I realize that some of you might have done this slightly different, but we're going to look at the Peel method here. All right, we're going to now look at the structure of this essay and how to tackle it. What structure do we expect from you to write? Now, there are many forms of it, but it does come down to the same thing. Now, let's start with the basics. There are 5 paragraphs in this literature essay, and you have to be able to structure it, firstly, chronologically in your argument, but also there are very specific places where you have to use each of these. Now, I've put it in order for you to have a look at. We first start in paragraph 1 with a general statement. And this is part of the introduction, right? And we have the thesis statement in the introductory paragraph. The general statement can be anything about the play, but it has to include two major things. One is the name or the title of the drama or novel that you're answering or discussing in this case. The second one is, of course, the title or the name of the author. For example, you can say, in William Shakespeare's Othello, the audience is introduced to a valiant soldier, Othello. Now take note, I've used Othello twice there. First, it was the name of the drama. You have to underline this when it is a title. For the rest of it, you don't have to underline the word Othello. Then the thesis statement. Now think about it like this. The thesis statement is the foundation of your essay. Whatever you write after your thesis statement will be the house that you build. If that foundation is not strong, gets to the point, and analyzes the actual topic you've been given, then unfortunately the rest of your essay will not score high marks. So, let's go back to how do I structure this? You will have in your introductory paragraph, paragraph 1, a general statement. Then you must formulate your thesis statement, which is based on your topic. Then you'll have 3 paragraphs. Now these 3 paragraphs will all follow your PEEL. That is the point, evidence, explanation, and the link. Now you have to do this 3 times and have 3 different explanations. Now we're going to work through each of them, and I'm going to show you what to do for all of them. Firstly, when I start each paragraph, the analytical paragraph, I have to look at the statement that I'm going to make that proves my thesis statement. You'll say something like, Othello is fooled continuously throughout the play by Iago. This is a statement you're making. The whole point of this essay is that for the rest of that paragraph, you have to prove it. Now be very careful. You can't make statements if they don't pertain to your thesis statement or go even as far back as your topic you have been given. Otherwise, what's the point of writing that? So in your evidence, I'm now supporting what I'm going to say in my point, the statement that I've made in my paragraph. You have to have 3 pieces of evidence to ensure that you actually are successful in analyzing and proving that statement. You'll say, for example, that Othello is made to believe that Iago is an honest man. He perceives Iago to be someone that always tells the truth. And maybe you can even mention something like he convinces Othello that Desdemona is cheating on him by providing evidence of sorts. That is only the evidence. That is the literal thing that you have read put into context here. Now, let's go to the explain part. You've given your point. You've mentioned 3 places in the play that this happens. And now you're going to explain, so what? Now, the explain part is the main part of the essay where we draw content mark from. It is the analytical part which you must be able to do by now. That means I look at my thesis statement, I take the information that I have from my play or drama or novel, and I combine the 2 to give you the overall analysis here, to prove that, for example, the one we've been using, Othello is duped by Iago. Right, and then you have to write more or less 2 or 3 sentences there of analysis. This shows us that, but I've used that purposefully now. Can we use the word us? No, you can't. There are 3 words that you can't use. I, we, and us. If you use them, very much like I did now, then unfortunately, we will deduct marks from your language part. And there's only 2 sections we can give you marks, which I'll show you now. Then we move over to your link. Now, your link is like the little bow on the present. It summarizes and concludes your paragraph. This has to go back to your thesis statement, the thing that you're trying to prove. This clearly shows that Othello is continuously duped by Iago, for example. Then, when you've done this 3 times, 3 different points, 3 different places of evidence, and 3 explanations and 3 different links. Then only do you move on to your concluding paragraph. Now, in your conclusion, please do not state new information. Sometimes we find that when working through all of this, you kind of end up coming up with new thoughts. Rather use that in your content analysis paragraphs. Analyzing paragraphs, my apologies. So in your conclusion, only summarize the 3 analytical paragraphs that you have analyzed there. Right, this is what the rubric is going to look like that we use to mark or assess your essays. You'll notice that there are 3 things we look at. The content, and then structure and language is the second category we're going to look at. The content mark, you will notice, counts more. And it's very important that you analyze this specific question that we've given you in relation to what we've taught you about the drama or the novel. Now, you can go have a look at that a little bit later to see more or less where am I, what do I need to improve on. If you know, for example, your spelling is really bad, maybe write down 5 or 10 words that you can use in your analysis of your piece. Also, you have to know the characters' names, you have to know how they interact, and how do the themes, messages, images, and even your symbols interact with these characters. Right, so let's quickly recap. What should you remember? What should you not forget? Firstly, very important, remember to number your answers correctly according to how it's been numbered in your paper. Now, I know this goes without saying, but what I like to do is I take my pencil and I actually tick off when I've completed that question. Or alternatively, I don't know what to say here, and I circle that. Leave at least 5 to 10 minutes at the end of your paper to revise the questions, all of them if you must, and see if you can't improve on some of the answers. Remember to not answer 4 questions in section A. Do not answer 2 contextuals. Do not answer 2 essays. You have to do one of each, and it has to come out of different sections. Be aware of spelling errors. If you spell a character's name wrong, it's actually someone else, and that guy's not in the play. So ensure that the names of the characters you are able to spell. And when it comes to the literature essay, if you exceed the word count, we stop reading from there. We'll continue reading, but we stop awarding marks from there. So in other words, everything you've written up to 450 words is what will count for marks. Try to remember to use inverted commas when we ask you to quote. Now, ladies and gents, very often we will not ask this, and we won't ask a direct quote. Most likely, you will have to paraphrase the words, except when it comes to poetry. And then when there's an open-ended question, remember to say yes or no, or I agree or I don't agree. Because how are we going to match your answer to yes or no? Right. And here are some links for you to use. You'll see they come from different places in South Africa, because it's good to see what other places in South Africa do. They have memos with them. They have little booklets you can look at if you feel like your notes are not adequate. Right, and good luck. Remember, you can tackle and be successful with this paper.